So thank you all for joining today's Lunch and Learn, Telecommuting During COVID-19, How Does It Shape the Future Workplace and Workforce, hosted by MnDOT's Office of Research and Innovation. My name is Michaela Resch, and we are excited to have Dr. Qian and Professor Lynn Scheid from the University of Minnesota joining us today. So this project was funded by the State Research Program through a special COVID-19 research solicitation in 2020, and this is one of 4 projects that investigated the impacts from the pandemic on Minnesota's transportation system. We'd like to extend a special thank you to the technical advisory panel members who helped guide this work. So before we get started, I'll read through the mandatory tennyson warning. So this session will be recorded for those who cannot attend. If you have enabled your camera during the session, the recording may include your image, which is private data under the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act. You are not required to allow MnDOT to use your image, and there are no consequences for declining to do so. To opt out of the recording, simply turn off your camera. I would now like to introduce our 2 lovely presenters. So starting off with Dr. Xinyi Qian. She is the director of the University of Minnesota Tourism Center. Dr. Qian conducts applied research on a variety of topics related to travel and tourism, including visitor behaviors, active transportation, sustainable tourism, among others. Her research has informed policies related to bicycling, and her visitor profile work has informed marketing and branding decisions in various Minnesota tourism destinations. Prior to joining the Tourism Center, Dr. Qian was a research associate in the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota. And now on to our second presenter. We have Neil Scheid with us today, and he is an extension educator at the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Community Vitality. His work focuses on supporting local leaders as they navigate economic changes in their community. His mission is to teach, coach, and connect local leaders as they try to make informed decisions about their community's economic future. So we will have time for questions at the end of the session, so please enter them in the chat box throughout the presentation. Dwayne Hill from MnDOT District 1, who served as the technical liaison for this project, will be available to participate in the Q&A. So I would now like to hand it over to our presenters.
I hope you can all hear me and see the full screen slide. All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for having me here today, giving me the opportunity to present on this recently completed project. And without further ado, let's jump in. So first off, again, special thank you to MnDOT for funding this project, and also special thank you to the Center for Transportation Studies at the University of Minnesota for all the project support. And our special thank you also goes to the focus group participants and also all the survey respondents. So what is the purpose of the project? We want to look at how temporarily shifting a large chunk of the workforce to telecommuting on a variety of things, on employers' support and policy implications, on employees' experiences, and on differences in terms of these experiences by, say, geography, demographic factors, and I call them life stage factors, but in particular, caregiving responsibilities. And here is a brief overview of the flow of the project, if you will. So we started out with a literature review in the focus groups, and I highly encourage you to read the focus group technical memo. It really only has like 5 or 6 pages, but it has so many rich materials coming out of these focus groups. And the focus groups largely informed how we developed both employee and employer surveys, and we really did a lot of outreach in terms of trying to get respondents to our surveys, both workers and employers, and eventually we analyzed the data and put together the report. So let's first look at some of the highlights from the worker survey. And in terms of a worker survey, let's look at their telecommuting experiences during the pandemic, or at least at the height of the pandemic. So what do we asked, so how many hours were you able to telecommute during the pandemic? And folks provided all these numbers, and we broke it down into chunks first, anywhere between 1 and 20 hours, so no more than half a week. We see that it is about 36%, and 21 to 39 hours, so more than half a week, close to full-time telecommuting, that is about 22%. And we do have about 27% who telecommuted pretty much the whole week. And we have another 27% who basically not only telecommuted, but also overworked during the pandemic. And we also calculated the average number of hours telecommuting each week among those folks who didn't overwork. And we got the average of 25 hours with a median of 30 hours. 30 hours. And with a fairly large standard deviation, which means that we have a greater variety among those folks who telecommuted each week anywhere between 1 hour and 40 hours. So I guess the more interesting things that we want to talk about is differences among the respondents to the worker survey. So we asked every respondent of their age, and then we grouped them into generations. So we have 4 generations, the youngest, Gen Zs, the largest, millennials, followed by Gen Xers, and lastly, we have baby boomers and older. And so what we can see is the youngest workers were able to telecommute the least during the pandemic. And this will be a recurring theme as we go into questions about potential for telecommuting after the pandemic. And we can see that millennials are still somewhat lower in terms of weekly telecommuting hours compared with Gen Xers and baby boomers. However, there really isn't difference between Gen Xers and baby boomers. Next, we looked at any differences in terms of education levels, and we did find some differences. And again, the biggest point, I guess, the finding is folks with a high school or less education were able to telecommute the least during the pandemic. And again, this will be a recurring thing later on. And highly correlated or say associated with education level is household income. And here again, it is a very stark difference. And what we see here is folks with an annual household income less than $50,000, they were able to telecommute also the least during the pandemic. And then we also looked at any differences in terms of race. And I must point out that the sample is racially representative, if it makes sense, in terms of Minnesota's population. And what we found is respondents who identified as white, their average weekly telecommuting hours was 27, which is more than all the others. And among the other 4 racial groups, we did not find any large differences. And then something very, very surprising. We asked if a survey respondent uses reasonable accommodations due to disability for work. And what we found is respondents not using reasonable accommodations due to disabilities had more weekly telecommuting hours compared with the folks who are using reasonable accommodations. And unfortunately, this will also be a recurring thing. And so far, we have not been able to come up with viable explanations, if you will. And then something else that may be a little bit surprising, that is in terms of geographic area. So we asked about respondents' primary residence, if you will, the location. Is it in a Twin Cities metro area, or if it is in greater Minnesota? And we also want to note that the sample is very close or almost geographically representative in terms of the population size in Twin Cities versus in greater Minnesota. And what we found is greater Minnesota respondents averaged 26 hours per week of telecommuting during the pandemic. Twin Cities metro area respondents averaged close to 24 hours. Per week for telecommuting during the pandemic. And so is it a huge difference? I wouldn't say so, but is the difference in a direction that I had expected? Not necessarily. And then let's go into post-pandemic. So telecommuting possibility after the pandemic among workers. So we asked, how frequently would you be able to telecommute post-pandemic? And what we can see is we have a large portion of respondents who said, well, I likely would be able to telecommute 4 to 5 days a week. That is close to 40%. And we had another 35% who indicated that they would be able to telecommute after the pandemic 2 to 3 days a week. And at the same time, more than a quarter of respondents who said that I would be able to telecommute no more than 1 day a week. And this is, aggregated results in a sense that no more than 1 day a week included all the respondents who chose 1 day a week, less than 1 day a week, no more than 1 day a month, only infrequently, or not at all. So just for the sake of clarity, you only see these 3 big categories on the slide. And then big differences. Recall that I mentioned generational differences will be a recurring theme, and here it is. And it is really striking in terms of a visual, in the sense that among those who said I would be able to telecommute no more than 1 day a week, we can see that the biggest chunk is the Gen Zs, which means that the youngest workers in our population are the most likely to be able to telecommute no more than 1 day a week. Meanwhile, if you look at the top of the chart, you would see that the baby boomers, followed by the Gen Xers, they were the most likely to be able to telecommute 4 to 5 days a week. And so I like to say the popular perception of Gen Zs, sitting in their childhood bedroom and telecommuting every day, at least that didn't quite pan out in our findings, in our results. And then we also found some gender differences as well. We can see that females would be more likely to telecommute 4 to 5 days a week compared with males post-pandemic. Meanwhile, males would be more likely to telecommute no more than 3 days a week. So either 2 to 3 days a week or no more than 1 day a week compared with the females after the pandemic. Now, again, education differences by educational level. Again, this is a recurring theme. And again, what we found is that those with a high school or less education are most likely to telecommute no more than 1 day a week. And we found that, interestingly, those with 4-year degrees or more are the most likely to telecommute 2 to 3 days a week. When we look at telecommuting 4 to 5 days a week after the pandemic, it is folks with some college or a 2-year degree. Those folks are the most likely to telecommute 4 to 5 days a week. And closely related, and again, recurring theme, differences by household income. And in terms of visual, again, it is somewhat striking to see that folks with an annual household income less than $50,000, they are the most likely to telecommute no more than 1 day a week. And they are the least likely, basically, to be able to telecommute 2 to 3 days a week, and then also not very likely to be able to telecommute 4 to 5 days a week. And another recurring theme that is using reasonable accommodations due to disabilities. What we found is folks using reasonable accommodations are more likely to be able to telecommute no more than 1 day a week. And folks not using reasonable accommodations are more likely to be able to telecommute either 2 to 3 days a week or 4 to 5 days a week. And then the life stage factors, still having child or children living at home or not. And what we found is those without children living at home are more likely to telecommute 4 to 5 days a week, while those with children still living at home are more likely to telecommute less frequently. But if we come to think of it, the baby boomers and older generations, given their current age, they are the ones least likely to still have children living at home, while the baby boomers are the most likely to telecommute 4 to 5 days a week after the pandemic. And so these two findings, when we put them together, they align with each other. Now, geographic area. Again, it is not, vast differences and very nuanced. So what we found is greater Minnesota residents, respondents are more likely to telecommute no more than 1 day a week. Twin Cities respondents more likely to telecommute 2 to 3 days a week. However, if we look at telecommuting 4 to 5 days a week after the pandemic, the two geographic areas almost identical likelihood, or say percentage of respondents who indicated telecommuting 4 to 5 days a week. And so that tidbit of a finding is also a little bit surprising, at least in a sense that it didn't quite reflect somewhat like a popular, even stereotypical perceptions. Now, onto something that is somewhat unique, I would argue, related to this project. That is, we asked a few identical questions in both worker and employer surveys. And so we are able to compare their answers directly. So what did we ask? First, let's look at questions about experiences during the pandemic. So first off, expectation of employee performance. We can see that employers are a lot more likely to say no change in expectation of employee performance, while workers are more likely to say the expectation is actually higher. Workers are also more likely to say expectations became more results driven, and they were almost identical in terms of likelihood to indicate that expectation of performance went down. Now, perceived employee productivity. This one is where workers and employers ran in completely opposite directions. If you look at the slides, you can see that workers are the gold color and the employers are the maroon color. You can see that workers are a lot more likely to say productivity went up, a lot more, somewhat more, or a little more. But in a nutshell, productivity went up. And employers were a lot more likely to say either productivity level was about the same or employee productivity went down. And so this is the extreme finding here in the sense that they just ran in opposite directions. But But a very encouraging and a reassuring finding in terms of support of employees' schedule flexibility. Basically, workers and employers largely agree that employers supported employees' schedule flexibility during the pandemic. And we not only they run in the same direction, and they strongly agree, somewhat agree, these are really high percentages, if you will. So that's great news. And we also asked a few questions about post-pandemic telecommuting scenarios in both the worker and employer surveys. And here is what we found. First off, we asked if employers developed a post-pandemic telecommuting policy at the time of the survey. And so what we found is employers were a lot more likely to say, no, we have not developed a post-pandemic telecommuting policy, while workers were more likely to say, yes, it is either already developed or currently being developed. At the same time, more positive news is employers were a lot less likely to say, I have no idea, right? Workers were a lot more likely to say, I'm not so sure about that. Now, telecommuting in terms of post-pandemic telecommuting frequency. Here, what we found is also largely running opposite directions. Workers were a lot more likely to indicate, yep, I would be able to telecommute, to different extents. But employers were a lot more likely to say only infrequently, and infrequently in the sense of no more than 1 day a month. And so this is also a piece of very interesting findings in terms of their perceptions or their outlook in terms of telecommuting potential after the pandemic. I do have a lot of backup slides, I'm not gonna lie, but this is the formal portion of the content in terms of my presentation today. And so that leaves us with ample time for questions and answers. And thank you all very much again for giving me this opportunity and for your attention.
Thank you so much for walking us through this study and your findings. I think for our Q&A, we might just start at the top of the chat box and walk through the questions that have come in and see how much time we have to get through the questions that people have submitted so far. So the first question came in from Kurt, and he is wondering if the survey included maintenance workers.
That's a very good question, and my most honest answer is I need to look back. We did ask for industry and profession, but these are just, Neil, help me out. What codes did we use for those industries and professions? I am afraid we wouldn't be able to drill down specifically to maintenance workers, but I can be wrong. Neil?
I think you're right, and I also can't quite recall what the codes were, but I'll try to look right now.
Yeah, thank you.
It looks like Christina added a helpful screen grab from the report of the survey respondent work areas, and it looks like about 7% of folks said they work in the transportation industry, but I don't think we know for sure if that's office workers or more maintenance staff. Dwayne, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I think I thought I would respond to, this was not focused on MnDOT employees. This was focused on industry statewide. And so Kurt's question about maintenance workers, there may be some people that have jobs that required them to come to work included in the survey, but I think when we looked at the data, most of the people with that type of job did not respond to this survey.
Yeah, because if they are the in-person nature of a job, frankly, the majority, if not all of the questions are just not applicable to these respondents. So it would be helpful to also refer to another study on telecommuting done by a couple of faculty/researchers at the Humphrey School. I know it is not funded by MnDOT. It might just be focused on the Twin Cities metro area, but they might be able to provide somewhat of a bigger background indication in terms of the percentage of the population who were or have been able to telecommute during the pandemic, or at the height of the pandemic at least.
Thank you. We had a question come in from Megan asking, are the effects of age still present when controlling for income and level of education?
That's a very good question. And let's see here. We didn't run the so-called higher level statistics, although we definitely can. And I would be curious to dig up the data file again to see either we run some, multi-factor analysis of variance, or even run some structural equation modeling, given we have a large sample size that would afford us this type of fancy analysis. But I can imagine some correlated influences on the telecommuting experience and potential in terms of age, education, and income. And we already saw that education and income were highly similar in terms of the visuals, right? But then, is it really only linear, or is it going to be somewhat you peak at a certain time and then slightly to go down just a little bit? It's an open question, but it's an empirical question.
Our next question comes from Luke, and he's wondering, curious if there is a correlation between career phase and number of telecommuting days per week. For example, Gen Z is more starting out in their individual careers and in positions that require more in-person presence.
Yes. We can only infer career phase through age, unfortunately, right? We didn't ask any question in terms of career phase directly, but I've been in even presentations at conferences publicly commenting on, Gen Zs are the youngest workers and they are starting out. They might have less autonomy to decide their own schedule, and they need to, establish themselves, their career. And so networking and mentoring in terms of these two aspects of career development, in-person format still holds large appeal. Hence, either from autonomy or career development perspectives, these are viable explanations for Gen Zs having the least telecommuting hours or days.
We had a similar question from Valerie on job types of respondents. So she asked, how do these stats relate to the type of jobs people do? So if you have more information you want to explore about the job types of respondents, you can go through that. Otherwise, I can add a link to that full report in the chat box, and people can check out that graphic to the survey respondent job types.
Yeah, let me see here. Here, I can share. Just making sure I share the right thing. Here is a full slide. Yeah, okay, so this is industry, and this is the profession. So again, this is the industry, and I'll wait for a few seconds. And this is the profession. And any other questions?
Yeah, thank you for pulling up those slides so quickly. So we had another question on survey respondents. So is the survey for the general public or MnDOT employees? All Minnesotans were able to respond to the survey.
Yes, it is not for MnDOT internally. It is not even for state employees in general. It is meant to be for the general public, and well, obviously adults at least 18 years old, and you need to be a Minnesota residents. I'm very careful with the wording here, not citizens, residents, and also, what's the other thing? There's got to be something else. Yes, the person had been employed at least part-time since March 2020.
Awesome, thank you. We had a question from Stephanie wondering, was there a further breakdown on ability to telecommute for those who work in an office-like setting versus a frontline position?
Unfortunately, we are not able to do that.
And we have a question from Joseph asking, were there any numbers or research on how many people have returned to work in person versus continued to telework, especially in the metro?
Good question. Let me see. Gotta be. It's not even in my backup slide, but yes, we definitely asked a question about where you were in terms of telecommuting at the time of the survey, and the choices are: I'm already back in the office, I'm in transition, and I am still telecommuting. So there definitely is a breakdown, and I don't recall any one category being dominant. And so unfortunately, yes, it is somewhere in the final report, but you know, it is a variety. I guess that's how I would put it.
Thank you. And I think it's helpful to note the survey time period. You might have already mentioned it, but the data was collected through July through September of 2021. So
yes,
things may have evolved since then as well.
Oh, yes, it is literally right around this time last year. We put it in a field, so to speak, so started data collection, really going all out to, generate responses, and we kept it both, I should say. I kept them open until close to the end of September. So a little bit over 2 months. And yes, it's been a whole year, and with the Omicron variant coming and going, and it looks like we might have yet another surge. It's ongoing, and it will be interesting to see how things have or have not evolved.
Thank you. We have a question from Mike asking, were you able to get insights about telecommuting prior to the pandemic?
Yes, we did ask questions about telecommuting prior to the pandemic. Not many questions, maybe 2 or 3 questions. Higher level, as you can imagine, more generally speaking. But yes, we did. I mean, Neil, if you can look at the final report, trying to dig it out, maybe a keyword search prior or before. Hopefully we can get us there. But yes, we did ask a few questions. While you're looking, do we have other questions?
The next question, and we'll come, if you find anything from the report, we can pop back to that one, comes from Elizabeth, and she is wondering, was there any information collected about onboarding or training virtually versus in person related to success rates or learning curves?
These are very good questions, but unfortunately we didn't, given that the survey was already pretty long with all the questions we did ask. That being said, I do remember the focus groups. Those were done largely with human resources professionals and a few, small business operators here and there. I remember comments from focus group participants saying that, wow, it really is a brave new world, because for the first time in my long career, she said, I onboarded someone completely remotely. I didn't go into the office to meet with the person in person at all. And the person started remotely. And so it definitely, it definitely has been happening.
Okay, I did find it on the final report, those pre-pandemic commute situations. There were, looks like it was 2 questions, and you could find those on page 17 of the report. I did want to just, respond to that, that comment about the, some of the focus groups and what came up there. It was very interesting and helpful for us to hear all the variety of ways in which businesses were responding to telecommuting and making it available as an option, but also the number of places that had already sort of been way ahead of this. And it definitely helped me think of this as far less of a dichotomy between either you telecommute or you don't, and to see that this really is quite a range, and probably will remain a range of options and availability going forward.
Thank you, Neil. We have a question from John asking, did you gather any statistics on the type of evaluations performed by the employers for employee performance?
No, we didn't. What we did, I already presented on in terms of asking those identical questions in both surveys, and quite honestly, asking those questions was specifically informed by the focus groups. And again, it is fascinating to hear the focus group participants saying that, our people, their productivity really went up, but at the same time, we really supported their schedule flexibility, which is why when I saw the results with supporting schedule flexibility, it really was good. It was encouraging, right? But when I saw how they just ran in opposite directions for perceived productivity, I was surprised, because the focus group participants, they were, largely HR people and a few small business operators. But this is what the numbers show us, and yeah, I hope you all still find it somewhat interesting.
Thank you. We have a question from Margaret. Also, she has 2 questions. The first is, did you evaluate if people were working more than one job?
Great question. I don't think so. No, I don't think so, unfortunately.
Okay. And the second question is, was there a question in the survey asking about if price of transportation, especially gas, influenced teleworking preferences?
No, at the time, I think gas price at the time almost hit the bottom or close to the bottom, quite honestly. And so it wasn't factored into consideration, although we did ask about your one-way commute length, like how much time would it take you to commute one way. What we found is folks with one-way commute longer than 45 minutes and the commute traffic is heavy, so a combo, right? And it's a very fatal combo, if you will. Folks with that particular combo, they are the most likely to say, I would telecommute at least somewhat, even after the pandemic. So getting out of the really bad and long commute traffic. So that makes sense.
We have a question from Lisa asking, curious to know if there was a question about employee engagement during teleworking. Was there an increase or decrease?
That's a good question. Let's see here. Neil, if you can also help, please. I cannot say for sure, especially given those identical questions that we asked.
We did talk, the focus groups were where some of those things came up the most, and employee engagement, it actually ended up being our participants wanted to share what they were doing to engage with employees, and there were a lot of creative things that came up on how people are onboarded, on how people you know, continue to connect, and sort of the rules and norms that are happening with participating in calls like this, and how people are navigating those difficult conversations that might need to happen. If you have to say you're expected to be on camera, sometimes people don't want that. Those sorts of things came up for sure. But also some surprising things. I mean, you might think that you know, like a high-tech company would be all remote and all online, and we heard from a few participants just that in some cases, even though the technology is the side, and you might assume that there is a lot of value to being in person and engaging, and that those companies were seeing that that's a valuable part of how they do business and how they stay competitive is actual interaction in person with people. And so that's where we heard about employee engagement at more depth, not necessarily in the survey.
And yes, what I also remembered is social engagement has been a challenge, which partially is related to our decision when we ask about expectation of employee performance. We had a choice option in terms of more results driven. And that is somewhat related to the engagement piece. And also, I think we also ask about employers' support of employees' well-being, not necessarily social engagement or engagement in general. It is more directed. And I do remember taking out a couple of questions out of both the surveys with the technical assistant panel's suggestions, because it's really just two nitty-gritty details. And then we're trying to go through a survey that is already long. They may not even be able to tell the differences, because at a certain point it becomes pretty nuanced. And so we didn't ask about engagement, but some were inferred, if you will, from some of the other questions we did ask.
And there were questions that related to which of the following did your organization provide for telecommuting employees during the pandemic? And there was several pieces of data that you could see there about taking equipment home, furniture home, offering stipends to purchase equipment or furniture, shipping equipment and furniture, other things like that came up. So again, sort of somewhat related, but not exactly employee engagement.
Thank you. We had a question wondering if this event is recorded and if it'll be made available. Yes, it is. We are currently recording, and we will get that posted on our Research and Innovation YouTube channel and distribute that after the event. We had a question come in from Roger wondering, are you making any recommendations, such as whether telecommuting should continue or whether a hybrid work environment is beneficial?
Well, that is always the big question, right? No, we didn't make any recommendations, although what we found with, again, the focus groups is that the word hybrid is more nuanced than we had thought at surface level, I guess. So hybrid really exists on 3 different levels. The individual level is that, well, I go into the office a few days a week, and then the other days I would telecommute, presumably at home. And then it is at the team level. We've heard a few, like nonprofits and foundations and so on and so forth. They're like, we would have these 2 teams coming in these 2 days, and the other 2 teams coming in the other 2 days, and then the 5th day, either everybody coming in or everybody at home. So that is at the team level. And then lastly, it is at the entity-wide or employer-wide level that a few might telecommute completely, like fully telecommuting. The vast majority will be hybrid. And then we would also have a few that would be coming in pretty much every day. And so, yeah, hybrid is an interesting and a nuanced word, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And I'll add and agree with you. We didn't make recommendations on whether this is good, bad, or indifferent. But I think it will continue. There will continue to be arrangements that allow for telecommuting, and they will be diverse, as Xinyi just mentioned. But we also heard from people that talked about some of the benefits that were maybe more unexpected, and those might be from a business side, an employer side. The changes that happened in the past 2 years have shown them and helped them, recruit in ways that they weren't able to recruit before. So recruiting from other states and other countries, people were almost forced to approach that and have applicants from other places that could fill jobs that they had maybe had open for quite a long time. And as we know in Minnesota, workforce shortages are an acute problem that the demographics point toward, will continue to be an issue. So there are costs and benefits on both sides of this, and I think that's just one of those unexpected benefits that we heard about in this study. And as with all studies, we always, when you know what the future looks like, you wish you would have asked other questions year prior, and I think there are plenty of opportunities for follow-up studies that can come from this work.
Yeah, what we found is employers are keenly aware that while they, at least in some situations, they can try to recruit from a wider geographic net, they also realize the other side of the coin is they are competing with, employers in other geographic areas from the same talent pool, and cross-state border recruitment could be a little bit complicated in terms of taxes or regulations or laws, and also, but at the same time, we had at least a quarter of employer survey respondents indicating that they would seriously consider, recruiting for fully remote workers so that they can cast a much wider net going forward for those positions that can telecommute completely.
We have a question from Cynthia wondering, was there any question or insight as to whether an employee would leave a job or not take a new one if telecommuting wasn't an option?
Oh, no, unfortunately, we didn't ask that question, although I'm saving the best to the last. Here is, okay. Will you consider relocating if you were able to telecommute full time? It's actually a very even split, so even that I went back to check the data twice. We had it right in the middle, the gray bar, we have 20% saying, I'm not sure. And then if you add up the numbers for the 3 likely answers, the top half of the chart, it's about 40%. If you add up the 3 unlikely choices, it is about another 40%. So we are really in a not so sure territory rather than, oh, people will just stick to where they live, which, you know, right now I would say that's largely the scenario, but it is also not like people are gonna move in large numbers and really shaking things up a huge time. That didn't quite play out in that way either. And even more interestingly, among those people who indicated at least a little likely to relocate. So this is a very important conditioning. We didn't ask where you would relocate to of everybody. We only asked this question to those who said at least a little likely to relocate. And this is where they say they would consider relocating to. And so one thing we should have done, but we didn't, is to compare their zip code, the zip code of their primary resident versus their potential relocating location to see how they, you know, pair up or not pair up, quite frankly. But right now we just have this most basic level in terms of their answers. And so it's not like a huge percentage of folks who are gonna relocate to either a micropolitan area or a rural area. We're adding those two categories together. It is about 27% of those who might relocate, if that makes sense.
And going off of that slide, John is wondering, do we know whether people being able to telework have already relocated?
That's a wonderful question. Unfortunately, we don't know. I would be very curious again to see a population level picture in terms of the percentage of people who can telecommute in the first place and then go from there. So if we can marry two studies, granted they have different samples, it might still provide some indications, but from this study alone, we cannot make any viable claim.
All right, we do not have any additional lingering questions. We have a few minutes left, so we can either wrap up here. Xinyi, Dwayne, Neil, do either of you have any parting words for us today?
Well, I do hope we hear from Dwayne on just, you know, how you see the results from this being useful in MnDOT. And I would also let people know that there have been some national statistics that have been released recently if you're really curious in this topic. And one of those is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that had also a 2021 business survey about teleworking during the pandemic, and that was released in March of this year. So I would just suspect that you'll continue to hear evidence coming out around this topic from a similar time period. This is about how long the lag takes to pick up the information and get it out to people.
Yeah.
And I'll give it to Dwayne.
All right, well, I can add a few things. I think MnDOT intentionally developed this research program related to COVID to learn a few things about COVID. And this particular project is helpful for us in a few ways. One of them was to look at how will telework affect congestion on our freeway system, particularly in the metro area. Second way is how will teleworking impact our goal of reducing vehicle miles traveled across the state. So one of the strategies we've talked about is that if people have to, or if our goal is for people to reduce VMT by 20% per capita, that means, you know, that everyone's going to have to do something different to change their footprint for driving, and maybe telework a day or two a week helps them move in the right direction. And then I thought the third thing that we could learn from the survey was maybe, what's the state of the workforce and how does that influence the decisions that are made by MnDOT or by other state agencies regarding how we structure our work in regards to telework. So I think those are three valuable things that we can look at this information and kind of help make better judgments about what's going to happen in the future.
Thank you so much, Dwayne.
Thank you, Dwayne.